Hello guys and welcome back to the cleanup where I react and correct random videos that pop up on my For You page. Now, none of you will know this because I haven't covered it on the channel yet, but I am a socialist. I know, controversial topic, but I think that the current economic order of capitalism cannot be upheld for much longer because of climate change and other factors, and that it is also fundamentally unfair because a large chunk of the population works for the benefit of a select few parts of the population. Not even talking about the global south, in which people have to slave away for the benefit of prosperity of the Western hemisphere. And I think that socialistic theory at least gives us a good ground on which we can work to create the order of a new, sustainable and fair society. I'll probably make a video in the future outlining the exact reasons why I'm a socialist, but for now I found a video criticizing socialism as false and never functioning, so I have gathered some data and wanted to, as they say, debunk this misinformation. So let's get started.
Internet. Recently, it came to my attention that a communist subreddit I covered in one of my older videos called Shit Liberals Say found one of my older videos covering them. Needless to say, they were not happy, and one of their core complaints of my video was that I was just slop and I didn't address any real communist talking points.
So I actually watched their older video and I kind of have to agree. At least there wasn't enough material for me to make a reaction video to it, from my point of view.
So first of all, of course it's slop. Most of my audience is intelligent enough to not take communists seriously in any way. In fact, I believe the sad reality is that even if everyone on this subreddit became a capitalist tomorrow, they'd still all be equally useless.
So what he's doing here is he is employing the rhetorical technique of poisoning the well. That is, attacking a person, or in this case a group, on a personal level before actually engaging with any of their arguments. This is done to try to discredit the argument, in this case as coming from supposedly useless, egotistical, unintelligent idiots. This hopes to make people that later listen to the debate internally biased against your opposition because they are all supposedly dumb. So if you actually find some of their arguments convincing, you must be dumb as well.
The reason they're communists in the first place is that they all quietly recognize this fact, but are too egotistical to acknowledge it, or too lazy to change it. If anything, I pity them, but obviously not enough to care about their feelings, hence why I make these types of videos in the first place.
Another thing he is doing is saying that socialists are all internally know that their ideology is flawed and wrong, but cling to it anyways. Once again, painting them as lazy people who just wanna find an ideology that fits their laziness, regardless of if it's false. This argument is also often used by theists when arguing with atheists about the existence of God, saying that all atheists internally know that God exists but are resisting the truth because they want to commit sin or something.
The second point they make is that I just don't understand real communism, and I'm just a stupid capitalist who wants to oppress people, and that's primarily what we're going to be addressing today.
If they really say it like that, that would be a weird idea, except if you have actually demonstrated that you don't understand what communism is, so let's see if you do.
My only hope is that they find this video and make another post responding to it, so I have more content to farm.
Hey, that's what I am here for. I doubt you'll find that video since my channel is still pretty small, but if you do, you're welcome to farm my content as long as you actually respond to it honestly.
So I'm going to be dividing this video into two parts. In the first part, I'll be dismantling communist ideology as a whole and explaining why there's really only two groups of people who would ever be a communist, and that is retards and children.
So another attempt at poisoning the well, painting all communists as either mentally disabled or children, which often lack knowledge and are therefore also commonly seen as dumb.
And in the second part, I'm going to be laughing at them some more in my usual format, satisfying all parts of my viewer base in a single video.
So I'm actually just gonna be reacting to the first part since I think it's more interesting. If you want me to react to some of the other videos this guy does, let me know.
So first, we'll address what is this true communism they're talking about, because I see a lot of people on the right either misinterpret or just not understand the ideology because it's not always clear what exactly they want.
Yeah, I see that too, but I think it's pretty clear, so let's see what you got for us and if you can define socialism correctly.
To steelman the most basic definition you'll commonly see, it's some variation of the idea that society should be organized around common ownership rather than private ownership of major productive resources. This would commonly include factories, land, railroads, banks, and large businesses.
Almost correct. It's the idea that all production should be organized by common ownership of the means of production, that meaning the factories should be owned by the workers and led by a democratic process. So the boss of that factory should be elected by the workers, and the workers should be able to replace them at any point in time so that it doesn't come to exploitation of said workers. The boss should also only be paid as much as a normal worker, so there's no monetary incentive to try to stay at the top, but only the incentive of actually managing the factory in a way that is beneficial to all.
Usually they're not talking about personal property like your shoes or your phone, or even more pedantically your toothbrush.
Yes, thank you! This is a misunderstanding that I see way too often in right-wing and general spaces. Thank you for defining that correctly.
The core perspective argument of communists is that workers among a society should commonly own production because profit comes from the workers' labor, and the main complaint is that private owners extract value from them. This oppressed working class is referred to as the proletariat, and these oppressed owners are labeled the bourgeoisie.
I actually don't have much to add here. That's a solid definition of the core contradiction within capitalism.
And that the relationship between the two is inherently exploitative. And the main goal, as we've all heard, is to abolish private property and the means of production. Now, as I said earlier, communists for the most part don't object to people owning houses or clothing or other personal belongings. We'll ignore the landlord critiques for this video. Their main concern is the private ownership of factories, businesses, and land to profit from other people's labor.
Again, yes, that's what we're after. It seems like, unlike many other critiques of communism on the internet, you actually know what you're criticizing. So let's hear your critique. I'm intrigued.
But this begs the question, who will actually own the means of production if not the owner of the business?
This is easy to answer. The workers will own it, and as I described earlier, it will be led through a democratic election of a leader of each factory or general single mean of production, if you want to call it that. In the case of land, the people can just use it themselves or elect like a manager as well who oversees the land.
The possibilities that supposedly aren't exploitative in any way are by the workers directly in smaller communities, I assume would be communes, or what I think is more inevitable, the state that supposedly works on behalf of the people.
Nope, the state on its own doesn't own anything. He, at least under socialism, not communism, communism is stateless, will manage the general planning of the economy. But of course, the state will also be democratically elected. This is actually the point where I myself have objections with socialistic theory, because it doesn't mention the possibility of re-election at any point and just says that officials of the state should stay in power for a set amount of time, just like in democracies today. Which I see as the risks for potential power grabbing and bad management, because once the people are in power, they will then be able to do whatever they want without the people having the power to punish them if they do bad things, like try to enrich themselves or something. But that's a topic for another video. For now, it's important to know that the state on its own doesn't own anything, and that it is also, like the factories, democratically elected.
To scratch the surface on the philosophical aspects of communism that are even easier to debunk, we've all heard the phrase, from each according to ability, to each according to need. And to simplify this with an example, a doctor, farmer, engineer, or teacher would all work according to their abilities, but society would guarantee everyone food, housing, healthcare, education, and all the other social programs the state is supposed to promise us.
There we got another slight misunderstanding. The phrase from each according to their ability to each according to their need is only applicable in an already communistic society, not in a socialistic one. This is because currently society is thinking on an individual and highly egotistical level. That's why we can't just abolish money tomorrow and expect people to work because they get that the benefits for them and their society are great. For this in-between phase between communism and capitalism, aka socialism, Marx coined another phrase, which is way less popular, that goes from each according to their contribution to each according to their need. So what Marx is describing here is actually that what many capitalists claim to argue for, the ultimate Mediatocracy, or as it calls in German, Leistungsgesellschaft, where each person gets exactly the same reward for the same work. One potential model of this would be for 1 hour of work, you can get like a check that just says 1 hour work time. With this you could then buy stuff. The important distinction here is that there wouldn't be a market or possibility to hold this new money by just trading money or anything like that, since every check would be immediately destroyed after you pay with it, and its flow would be controlled by the state, not by profit-oriented banks.
Simply put, human survival should not depend on the success of a market or capitalist institution. To summarize, the ultimate goal of communism, if it isn't obvious by now, is to create a classless society, to essentially abolish economic classes. Now, it should be obvious to you guys why communism ultimately advocates for a classless and moneyless society, and if you're extra retarded because none of this could even be remotely possible without a state, they want a stateless society too.
Again, a communistic model looks at society from a general different perspective of unity. To create the conditions on which such a society is possible, we first have to have socialism to slowly but surely, over multiple generations, get people away from thinking about profit and egoism for themselves and thinking about society as a whole. But even if you think this somehow isn't possible, even a socialistic society would be significantly better and less exploitative than a current capitalistic one.
I think it would be pertinent to briefly discuss socialism as well, and why people often both compare the two and get them confused sometimes. Even governments, which we commonly refer to as communist, wouldn't actually be communist in the theoretical sense. A quote, real communist would argue that they never actually achieved true communism, which is actually true. The problem is that socialism is actually more accurately defined as a transitional stage to communism, where the working class starts to take control of the state and economy.
That's a great basic definition. I don't know why you got confused with these definitions so far.
However, it just so happens that every time there is a significant push in this direction, it always just devolves into a one-state party and everyone becomes poor and nothing beneficial for the proletariat actually happens.
And now it goes downhill. As you can imagine, this isn't true at all. Even if we take a state like the Soviet Union, which later did indeed disintegrate into an authoritarian state, it still had massive benefits for the working class. Before the socialistic society, Russia had a literacy rate of about 20%. By the end it got over 90%. Also, unemployment went to basically zero. And healthcare significantly improved as well. And the socialistic countries always devolve into dictatorships argument is also not true. To see that, we have to look at smaller socialistic countries like Vietnam, Chile and Cuba. All of them had or have, during their socialistic period, legitimately elected leaders. It was the US who then, for example in Chile, made a push to get these leaders away from power illegitimately. In Cuba, it was also largely the US who caused the economic crisis by boycotting them and blocking other countries from trading with them ever since they became socialistic. So these two statements are just not true, and he also doesn't have any sources to back them up. In contrast to me, because the last thing I want to do is spread misinformation.
And the most obvious reason for this is because it tries to replace the most powerful and base system on Earth, the market. A system that tries to account for millions of individuals and their choices, incentives, and their relation to ownership is just inevitably bound to fail every single time.
Again, the reason these countries did fail was not because of socialism itself, but largely because of outside factors. In the Soviet Union, most people weren't actually part of the working class, but were peasants and farmers. As soon as the working class took over, they struggled to bring peasants on their side because of poor management. Also, they were faced with multiple wars like the Civil War and the Second World War, and because of the low literacy rates, there weren't many people to actually manage the country and factories. Because of this, they made the fatal decision to pay managers and politicians more than the average worker, sometimes 4 times more. This then led to the emergence of the bureaucracy and a new class divide with it. Despite all of this, they still managed to turn one of the most backward nations in Europe into one of the most powerful that could even compete with the US. It is also worth to mention that the actual dissolution of the Soviet Union wasn't actually a dramatic breakup or resistance of the countries within the Soviet Union against the Soviet Union, but it was an undemocratic process of signing papers. A few months before, a country-wide survey was conducted asking the people of the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union should persist. And even in the countries outside of Russia, like Hungary and Ukraine, 70% said yes. 70%. But it was dissolved anyway, because fuck democracy, I guess. This is also only a brief overview. Please inform yourselves with the sources, or generally if you wanna have this in more detail. The other smaller countries all basically failed because of American intervention. Chile was overthrown, Vietnam was defeated in a war and then the US installed a dictator, and Cuba was embargoed and couldn't survive on its own without trade from other countries. Which is something that Lenin already said after the revolution in Russia. Socialism in one country can't persist, especially if it's surrounded by capitalistic nations.
And there's a very clear explanation as to why, and it is the ECP, also known as the Economic Calculation Problem. Very simply, in a market system, the price or how much money you have to pay for something, you know, that thing they want to abolish, provides people with very important information. That information being how expensive is a product to produce, how many people want or don't want the product, if the product is scarce, or if the product is profitable and should be produced more. If there's no market or competition or prices, the ones doing the centralized planning would have no actual indicators of what to produce.
This argument can be refuted by simply pointing to the inner workings of capitalistic firms like Walmart. Within a firm, the production of parts and products has to be planned. The different departments of a firm like production, delivery, sales department have to work and plan together to know what to produce, how much to produce, and when to produce. To do this, they have access to huge amounts of data. That is how much demand there is for one particular product. They can then estimate how much they need to produce of that particular product in the future based on the data. And before you bring up the "this only works in small scale and not on a country" argument, Walmart's GDP, so to speak, is as high as this of Sweden, so this doesn't apply either. To get this point in more detail, I would recommend reading the book The People's Republic of Walmart, which actually elaborates this point further.
A commonly used example is the question, if I have a finite amount of steel, how do I know exactly how much of it needs to go to either a bridge, a railway, or a building? Well, the simple answer is you don't.
You can calculate how much steel is needed for a bridge. How do you think this is done now? The only difference between the building process of a bridge in a capitalistic society and a socialistic society is that building materials come from private firms where there's something to profit off of it. And also, someone has to either profit off the bridge later, or it has to be built by the state, which isn't part of capitalism.
There were many ways the USSR actually tried to solve this clear and obvious problem. They would set targets of output for industries to meet, whether it be tons of steel, meters of steel, or just value in rubles. So if factories were told to produce by weight, it had an incentive to use more expensive methods of input, which led to staggering amounts of inefficiency in the means of production. Another example was window glass. Soviet planners tried measuring window glass by tons and ended up making the glass too thick and heavy, and when told to do it by square meters, it made the glass too thin.
Yes, there were many inefficiencies in planning. This was partly because of the bad communication between the working class, who was in power, and the peasants, who of course partly had to produce products like food and such. partly because of the slow building up of the bureaucracy and the monetary incentive to stay at the top, which led to numbers being reported falsely because the managers didn't want to score their image and potentially get down and not paid as much. And partly just because technology, especially in the Soviet Union, wasn't there. They had to calculate it all by hand, which is widely different and much more serious conditions for such a huge planned economy. Also, because of the disconnect between the peasants and the working class, this led to a top-down planned economy rather than a democratic planned economy, like it's supposed to be in a socialistic theory. Trotsky, one of the major revolutionaries in his book Revolution Betrayed, already saw in advance that this top-down planned economy would eventually lead into a huge crisis of the Soviet Union.
You don't need to be an economist to realize exactly what would happen before they even tried. I could list even more examples like clothing sizes and shoes, or really any other industry that relied on centralized planning. The inevitable result of all this was shortages of necessary products or even excess of unnecessary products, not to mention that a lot of the projects they did start were never finished due to these massive economic and labor shortage problems. This is why the entire system is dog shit from top to bottom, even from a, quote, theoretical standpoint.
Even if we stay in the Soviet Union, they did have a massive economic spike after the change into a socialistic system. The problem with this is mostly that the comparison is done unfairly. The Soviet Union had started out with a GDP similar to India in the 1920s and only needed 3 decades to economically combat with the US, a country that had about 4 more decades more time and used huge amount of slave labor to their advantage, all while fighting a civil war and the Nazis, and being massively sanctioned and threatened by said USA. On another note, studies actually have shown that at the same level of economic development, socialistic countries provided a higher quality of life on average than capitalistic ones. Lastly, it's interesting to me that every time a socialist country like Cuba fails, it is attributed to the system of socialism, not the surrounding factors like the US embargo. But if a capitalistic nation is in similar conditions, like many countries in Africa, then it's never attributed to the system of capitalism. Just something to think about.
We're only really scratching the surface of the issues too with communism, because I can make a whole video on the philosophical aspect as well. Like, what if someone decides they don't want to work? Now we're left with 3 options. We either enslave them, kill them, or feed them, essentially stealing from the productive members of society so that the unproductive can still live.
In a socialistic nation, this wouldn't really be a problem since, as explained, there it is still all about contribution. But in a communistic society, this has a model of an altruistic society in which people work because they want to. The human natural instinct to work on something has been shown time and time again. But you can actually experience it for yourself. You just have to sit around and do nothing. Eventually, you will want to do something. And provided that you don't just scroll on TikTok all day, you will work on something. Even if it's something that only you want to do, like making this video, for example.
There is no longer a natural incentive structure to work if you're guaranteed resources.
We have a natural incentive structure to work. It's called biology and evolution. How do you think people survived before capitalism, where they're just sitting around in their caves doing nothing all day?
Now, all that being said, there are real critiques of how our current economy and businesses are run, but most of the time, they fail to recognize that the problems more or less stem from the marriage between the state and corporations, and what I think is actually socialistic. Monopolies are only able to exist because of state aggression with things like IP laws, patent laws, and regulations to keep the lower and middle classes from being able to compete.
No, that's just wrong. Monopolies are a natural consequence of capitalism. If you have a competitive system, there are always losers and winners. And if the system is also built in such a way that every time you win, aka your firm gets bigger, it also gets even easier for you to win again, because now you have more resources, you can buy smaller firms, you can improve your product, you can market more aggressively. You will eventually end up with a monopoly. A very simplistic model of this can actually be found in the board game Monopoly. In Monopoly, there is essentially not much of a state, and what happens? Monopolies form. Granted, this is of course much more simple, but it is a good illustration of the concept of pure capitalism. Also, did he just call patents socialistic?
So really, a lot of their critiques of capitalism aren't critiques of capitalism at all, which is why when they try to mock us by saying whenever we point this out that they're saying it's not, quote, real capitalism, the same way they say it's not real communism, but if you actually look at what a staunch capitalist believes, they are being entirely consistent with their principles. As opposed to what communists believe in theory, to which the logical conclusion is both centralized state control, and everyone will work as hard or as little as they want, and be happy with the little they're provided.
No, not the little they're provided. To each according to their needs, remember? Also, you had such a good definition of the two distinct concepts, why do you keep mixing them up?
If I had to summarize this entire section, I would do it like this. The goals of a capitalist society are achievable if you're brave enough. The goals of a communist society are achievable if you're useless enough.
He never defined what he meant by useless, by the way.
A brave society will accept the consequences of those failing, and a useless society will kill a cowardly society once they're no longer useful.
I have no idea what that's supposed to mean, but that was it, guys. I hope you have learned some stuff and are now armed better against misinformation. The sources are in the pinned comment if you want to check them out. Anyways, like and subscribe, and always remember, trust us with your everything.